Good afternoon, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, Mature Relationships and Art Form. And I humorously sent out a message to all my colleagues inviting them to this webinar saying that I have decided to choose a topic on which I have an established track record of utter incompetence, and would they please kindly subject themselves to my tutelage. So in all fairness, I must tell you today that there are many topics I keep speaking about, but I honestly believe that if there's one topic that I'm least qualified to speak about, it is this one. So I would leave it to your powers of discernment to be able to get value from somebody who's sharing and speaking on a topic on which, as I said, they have an established track record of utter incompetence. Can you still take away some value? Because when you take away value from such a presentation, when someone who knows nothing about the subject is waxing eloquently about it, the credit to whatever you get is entirely yours to keep. It has nothing to do with the speaker because he had nothing to give you. So let's start off. And as we do usually with many of these webinars, I like to acknowledge what is the source that has inspired the topic. So I happen to be reading this book called Maturity, the Responsibility of Being Oneself. So there were a number of life circumstances that pointed to me that maturity seems to be in short supply in my life. So I turned to a book on the topic called Maturity, The Responsibility of Being Oneself by Osho. And then as I was reading through it, there was a chapter on the mature relationship. I said, wow, that might be a good topic to talk about and explore, through the lens of wisdom and spirituality. So we called it Mature Relationships and Art Form. So let's begin by acknowledging that there are three dimensions to love. One is dependence, the other is independence, and the third is interdependence. So if you look at the architecture of relationships, you will find that there are some relationships that are predicated entirely on a dependence, a mutual dependency relationship, where one person depends on the other. That might mean that they exploit each other, they dominate each other, they try to possess each other. So those are relationships based on possessiveness, domination, and exploitation of the other. So those are relationships where dependence is a major part. The other kind of relationship is at the other extreme, which is complete independence. You have two islands that are very well defended, very well protected, and the boundaries are clear. But there are two islands trying to build a bridge and relate with each other. And this also brings misery and tremendous conflict because both islands are more committed to their own freedom and perhaps more committed to avoiding the domination by the other island than they are to being in a relationship. We all know relationships where we have struggled so hard to avoid being dominated by the other, and that becomes the primary driving force in the relationship. But the good thing about the two independent people relating is that they give a tremendous amount of freedom to each other. But there is a difference between a freedom that seems like to be coming out of love, the desire to give freedom out of love, versus a freedom that feels more like detachment, a freedom that feels more like indifference. So you will often find people who are very much stuck in their head, analytical, logical, intellectual people giving a lot of freedom to their partner, but the freedom doesn't really feel like it's coming out of a deeper love or relatedness. It seems like it's coming out of a sense of detachment or indifference. Now, the rarest of all relationships are those that are predicated on a paradigm of interdependence. So you have relationships based on dependence, where there's domination, possessiveness, exploitation. There are relationships that are based on independence, where there are two islands trying to relate to each other. But on the other hand, there's a lot of conflict because each island becomes an ego. And the third is the interdependence, and how Osho describes it is one soul in two bodies, one soul in two bodies. And he says a part of paradise falls on the earth whenever that happens. It's like the flower shower, and a part of paradise fall on the earth. Two persons who are neither dependent nor independent start relating and start vibrating in synchronicity. And he calls that love when that happens. Now, he also draws upon C.S. Lewis and Abraham Maslow's vocabularies to distinguish two different kinds of love. So he talks about, C.S. Lewis talks about need love and gift love. And Maslow talks about deficiency love and being love. So both of those distinctions are virtually coterminous with each other. A need love is one that arises out of deficiency, you know, where you feel inadequate, you feel incomplete, and you reach out to the other in a desperate sense of scarcity to complete you. You are not comfortable being alone, and therefore you need to bridge with the other. And that's the need love. The gift love is where you're offering your love more as a gift, where you are overflowing with your own sense of purpose, your own sense of delight in life. And then you're building a bridge, you're giving the love more as a gift rather than as an expression of an inner lacking within you. And similarly, um, uh, with Maslow's distinction of deficiency love and being love, the deficiency love is one that's rooted in a source or state of scarcity, and the being love is one that comes from a state of abundance. And Osho talks about how real maturity comes only when you become loving, not out of need love, like needing something from the other, but a kind of unconditional overflowing of your spirit of celebration. And it's not about how much you're getting, but it all becomes a sense of joy in giving to the other and giving unconditionally. Another beautiful metaphor Osho talks about is of flowers blooming in a deep forest. If a flower is blooming in a deep forest, you will notice that it continues to bloom in all its resplendence, in all its fragrant glory, regardless of whether somebody is passing by the flower or not. The fragrance is being continuously released into the world, regardless of the presence of another. And this metaphor becomes the bridge to distinguishing between a relationship based love, where you say to another person, I love you, and you experience a state of love only in relation to the other. Now, if the other were to go away, you're not experiencing the love anymore because your ability to love is based upon or dependent upon the presence of the other. Versus love as a state of being, as a state of fragrance. When you attain to love as a state of being, you become a loving presence. And when you become a loving presence, you are not necessarily being selective in terms of how you're loving. You are releasing love as a fragrance. Somebody might come, somebody may not come. And as I often joke about this, Mahatma Gandhi, an exalted soul like Mahatma Gandhi may walk by and he will smell the fragrance of the jasmine flowers in the garden or the forest. And a serial killer like Jeffrey Dahmer might walk by and he will also feel the fragrance of the flowers. And in no other example in the history of humanity have the names of Mahatma Gandhi and Jeffrey Dahmer been woven together to make a point in the same sentence. So the credit goes entirely to me. So love as a fragrance means that we have done the inner work that is needed to clear the barriers that arise, the ego-based barriers within ours, to be possessive, to be dominating, to be manipulating, and all the games that we play, the games that lovers play. We have transcended that state of consciousness. We have seen that this worldly love as we know it is really not love. It is highly conditional. It is politics. It is manipulation. It's possessiveness. It's domination, masquerading with in the garb of love. And a deep level of discernment from where you begin to start doing the inner work and you release those blockages. What kind of inner work are we talking about? I often talk about unsobbed tears, the sadnesses that we have, the masks that we wear, where you feel at peace with yourself and your level of accepting yourself has matured to a point that you can take off those masks and be seen for who you are. You come to a place where you're not trying to defend yourself against what you might see as the bad news about yourself. Like if somebody comes to me and says, Param, your love is not true love. It is coming out of your own sense of insecurity. So you're claiming to love me because you're insecure in your own skin. Rather than pick a fight, I would say that might be true. Maybe you're speaking a great truth. One of the amazing things about self-acceptance is that criticism does not destroy you. When you are standing in self-acceptance, even the harshest of criticisms doesn't feel like a thorn. It feels like a beautiful flower. It enriches your being because you know that the other person is not your enemy. Nobody is your enemy. And in fact, whatever they say is becomes a deep contribution to adding a layer of enrichment to who you are on the journey becoming. So flowers blooming in a deep forest attain to fragrance. Like that, we as human beings do the inner work. And if we fall in love with ourselves, we accept ourselves unconditionally, we start being able to radiate that almost as a fragrance, almost as an energy field. Dependence, unfortunately, on the other hand, and relationships of dependence lead to a lot of conflict because when we are dependent on another person, you can never really love that person. A part of you hates that person. I'm sure we've all had relationships where we have felt hopelessly dependent at one point or the other. You know, it's just part of the journey of individuation. And you notice that you will have a deep resentment against the other person because you feel that you exist because the other exists. And that kind of dependence breeds its own resentment. Totally independent entities lead to a lot of conflict because that kind of independence is often with ego and you're trying to dominate and so on and so forth. So interdependence and a truly loving relationship requires two mature people. Now, who is a mature person? That itself, there could be so many different perspectives, but I want to invoke very briefly an author that I have talked about on previous conversations with you, Eric Berne, and his work on transactional analysis and his seminal work, Games People Play, where he talks about how we exist in three states. Some of us exist predominantly in a parent state of functioning, where we are looking around constantly, right? As if we are the parent in the room. So whenever you see somebody, you go into a parent mode. Now, when you go into a parent mode, there are two dimensions to the parent mode. One is the critical parent. Then you're constantly judging yourself and you're judging other people. So the kind of relationships that you form from a critical parent state are ones based on judgment. There is the other parent, which is the nurturing parent, which is always so very kind and generous. Oh my God, I'm so compassionate. This person is kicking mud in my face, but he must have had some deep childhood trauma. So I'll just let him kick mud in my face and let me nurture this person. So I'm just caricaturing a friend of mine who's on this call actually was saying that I'm in danger of becoming that kind of person by the way I relate to people. So as a way of thanking him for his feedback, I'm flagging that piece of feedback. So you become nurturing, right? Now there are two of these, critical and nurturing. So you could be relating to people from one of these two states. The other extreme is the child ego state. Maybe you know how to relate to people only from the child ego state. Now, the child ego state could have four dimensions to it. The happy child, oh yeah, I'm happy, and you're relating to people from a space of happiness all the time. Or the victimized child, you know, why does this have always happen to me? Why do people always treat me like this? And you are relating to people from a victimized state. Or you could be relating from a rebellious state, being a rebellious child, wanting to rebel against everybody. You know, so even if a person comes to you with love, you are engaged in rebelling against them, and you know, and all of that. And we'll talk a little more about the anatomy of a rebellious relationship and what happens. And of course, the other one is the compliant child. The compliant child is just conforming and complying. Many of us are a compliant child. Many of us have been in relationships where the other person is the compliant child or we are the compliant child. We just do whatever it takes. You know, it's almost like, and compliant children are so constituted that whether at work or whether at home or whether at school, the teachers and their authority figures and their partners are so happy because they're always complying. And of course, the downside to that is, will they ever give themselves the joy of being able to sing their own song and sing their own verse, or forever? Is it going to be an exercise in subjugating, subordinating oneself to the will of another? So we talked about operating from the parent child or the child ego state. The third one is the adult. which is a very rational state of functioning. So then you find yourself relating to people and you're always the adult in the room. You're the one who's bringing a modicum of rationality. When there are the volatile, emotional child types, you rein them in. As in the words of Pink Floyd, you got to keep the loonies on the path. And that's your motto. When you're the adult, you're that person who's good at keeping those loonies on the path. You keep the parents in check, the adults, the children in check, and you are the adult. But notice what Osho talks about in terms of mindfulness and awareness is that all these three ego states are masks. They are not authentic. The parental ego state is something you've copied by observing the parent. And society has a model of how you become a person who's either nurturing or critical, and you play one of those psychological roles. The child ego state is probably a leftover, a vestige from your own childhood. You're busy being the happy child, the sad child, the victimized child, the rebellious child, the compliant child. You could be that. The adult ego state is what happens when society wants you to behave in a certain way within a box of logic and reasonableness. But also notice, you know how being reasonable is so exalted? One of the interesting things when you study human greatness, and that was the topic of my dissertation, is that greatness actually is often a negation of reasonableness. Greatness, when history happens, when history is created, people are not just being logical and reasonable, they're actually flying in the face of what you consider logic and reason, because logic and reason is like a box that helps to maintain the status quo. So then, what is beyond these three states? We don't have a name for it, but it's a state of inner awakening where you're neither playing the socially scripted role of parent, nor the leftover vestiges of the unfinished business of your childhood, so being a child, or trying to be that adult in the room. You have come to your original face. You have a level of agility that sometimes you can be the child and you can enjoy being the silly child. Sometimes you can be the nurturing parent when nurturing is called for. Sometimes you can be the critical parent when a little bit of harsh feedback is needed. You can be an adult if that's called for. You can be any of these things, but you're not one of these things. You are so fluid. You are as open as the sky itself. Just as the sky can change color from being rainy to being sunny to all of that, to being red, to being blue, to being filled with clouds, to being just vast expanse. In the same way, you can be all of these things, but you're not any one of these things in a space of being attached. So you've gone beyond parent and child and adult and all of that. So why do we need to get in touch with these ego states? Because many of our relationships are ones, if you look at the underlying architecture, they are ones that are designed where you are functioning from one of these ego states, like in a way that you're a prisoner of one of them, not like you have a choice about it, not like you have a level of agility that you can be one, stuck in one, but you can go from, and the other person also takes a fixed position. How many of us have known relationships where we are the parent and the partner that we are relating to is always the child? We've known those relationships. Some of us, and it's very important for you to understand what kind of relationship you gravitate towards, because often our relational formulas are replications of what our parents exhibited. If my mom and dad had a parent to child relationship, the chances are that I'll have imbibed that at a deep level of unconsciousness, and I will play out the same pattern. So notice the extent to which the relationships that we have with significant others and partners tend to be a replication of the hangover left over from the relationships that we have observed between our parents and so on, right? So sometimes the relationship is between the critical parent and the rebellious child, a lot of conflict. The critical parent is constantly criticizing, and the rebellious child is always giving the extended middle finger and saying, get lost. And those are conflict-ridden relationships. Or it could be between the nurturing parent and the rebellious child, where the nurturing parent is trying to nurture endlessly and the rebellious child is busy rebelling endlessly. So notice how many different configurations and shades and dimensions these relationships can assume. It's so beautiful when you see how complex they are. Just being in them, observing them becomes like a pastime. It's like bird watching. You can watch birds, you can watch, nature in the same way you can start look at relationships around us and see, oh my God, how deep and mysterious are the ways of life that two human beings, and it's so amazing. Where sometimes you can see two human beings by themselves, they're a certain way. How many of you have been in situations when the moment you see them relating to each other, there's something that they produce that is beyond what they seem to embody individually, right? And sometimes they rise up to the highest states of exalted consciousness and pull each other up. They start at the base of the mountain, and the relationship is so life-giving that they gravitate, levitate spiritually towards the heights of consciousness. And there are others where they start midway and they actually pull each other down to the deepest, darkest valleys. So it is amazing to see how relationships can exercise that kind of a effect on us. So I lost my trend of thought, but I don't know that there was much trend to this thought anyway. So we're talking about relationships where, I don't know. I do want to, I'm going to go to the chat because Ajay had a point here that he made, which was a very interesting one, where he made a distinction between childish versus childlike, right? Best to be childlike, not childish and interdependent. Isn't that interesting? To be childlike and interdependent is a totally different nuance. Yes, I got my trend of thought back as I gravitated towards the chat. So I was explaining how often our relationships are a good diagnostic tool. And remember, these are diagnostic tools are just tools. They are not real. We use a diagnostic tool to see to a deeper dimension of reality. But once we do that, we should not be hanging on to the tool. We should toss it out. It's like a disposable thermometer. You take a reading, but don't make a prison out of the tool. How many of us have seen people who've taken the MBTI and they start swearing by the MBTI as if that's the truth, as if they got a physical thermometer reading? No, these are all little toys and tools by which we are enabled to look within ourselves and into each other at a deeper level of understanding that would not be possible without the help of the tool. But we never must cling to it. We should let go of it and rediscover each other, because as human beings, we are such vast bodies of mysterious consciousness that no attempt to fit us into the Procrustean bed of some taxonomical classification will ever be enough to deal with the enormous, untamable complexity of our natures. I pulled that out of my mouth. That was like a quote. It sounded good, at least to me. Okay, so basic challenge is therefore to become mature. And one of the interesting things is when we attain to that level of maturity, we seem to attract mature people. As you look at your own relational biodata, you will notice that relationships that were formed at the time when you were immature, you attracted a certain cast of characters who were drawn to you like a magnet. And sometimes the games that we played were so complementary to the games that the other people needed you to play. Like, for example, Eric Byrne jokes about, now I got you, son of a bitch. And I'm sorry for the language. He uses very sexist language, and I'm trying to be faithful to his terminology. I would not have used that language otherwise. He calls that, now I got you, son of a bitch, where someone's out to get somebody. And he says they're likely to form a very deep, unbreakable partnership with somebody else who's playing the complementary game of kick me. So you see how those two will fit together like a glove. So Eric Byrne is cautioning us about how we tend to form configurations, patterns, and architectures of relationships that fit like that. So to use it as a diagnostic tool to see how. Now, I'm not even glorifying the adult-to-adult relationship. How many of you know that a purely adult-to-adult relationship can be so unspicy and so devoid of playfulness, so devoid of all those extremes, the vicissitudes of life, the realm of free play, the realm of passion and all of that, two people being highly logical, analytical, and really not experiencing each other, because they're so mind-centered, so rational and logical. So there's none of these patterns that I'm trying to glorify. It's not that there's one right model, adult to adult, child to child, child to parent, adult to parent, but it's important to know what these patterns are, because from the perspective of Eastern mystics like Osho, it is only when you can see a pattern that you can become free of it. In fact, many Eastern mystics like Osho would say, when you become aware of a pattern, don't even try to change it. Because the very act of you trying to change it means you're resisting the pattern. And when you try to resist a pattern, the pattern will resist you in turn. So whatever you push against is going to push back, and you will become even more deeply entrenched in the pattern. For example, a colleague of Ajay was telling me about how I was telling him I'm in so much pain. And one of the great gifts that he gave to me was, don't resist the pain. Because if you resist the pain, you are going to be in even more pain, because pain feeds on resistance. You're telling the pain, I hate this pain. I don't want it to you to be you're pushing. Anything that you resist will persist. To just be with the pain rather than to resist it would be one of the great gifts that you would be giving yourself. And yes, I did experience a tremendous relief from pain, taking that advice of not resisting the pain and just allowing it to be. Now, which brings us to one of the great insights that Osho talks about in this book on maturity, where he says, he quotes the French mystic Gurdjieff, who would often say, if you come to me, tell me if you have solved your relationship with your mom and dad. If your relationship with your mom and dad is still in an unfinished state, don't come to me, I cannot help you. What did he mean by this? He meant that the remnants, the psychological remnants and fragments of the unfinished business we have with our mothers and fathers are insidiously imported into our relationship. It becomes part of the armor that we carry around us. And therefore, Gurdjieff places a tremendous amount of emphasis on dealing with that unfinished business from our own childhood, of being aware of it and working on it, and otherwise it's likely to be there. And our inability to form mature relationships is because we have unprocessed stuff from childhood. Unmet needs that never got met, moments of powerlessness where we had to develop certain coping strategies and patterns that we never gave ourselves the courage to ever relinquish and transcend. So we tend to use those coping patterns mechanically and repetitively. We tend to reproduce past realities because we are unable to emancipate ourselves from them. So it's only by completing that piece of work. And that kind of completion, there are so many beautiful books that talk about how to complete with your parents. Sometimes your parents don't even have to be with you. They might even have passed away, but you can complete with them, because completing with another does not require the other to be there with you. You can complete with another even with the other not being there with you, because completing is a state of inner resolution. Okay, Biman Ghosh says acceptance of patterns is a must, but not trying hard to evolve just for the sake of accepting the developed pattern is missing opportunity of enjoying life to the fullest. Yes, I totally agree with Biman Ghosh, and I'm grateful he provided that countervailing point to what I had said. Just accepting for the sake of accepting is not going to do it. That is actually not just accepting, that's actually making a decision not to change. And that would be counterproductive. I love what Biman says, because you know how our minds can trick us into making us think we are taking a healthy path while trapping us in delusional and dysfunctional paths. And sometimes language is so deceptive. Notice how fluently I'm talking about mature relationships. And there's not one iota of evidence in my life to suggest that I have even tasted the fleeting fragrance of that capability in myself. And yet, I'm talking about it. There's just two more points I want to make before I liberate you from this immature relationship you have entered into with me, of me talking to you continuously, so that you can be liberated from that. And I love this Osho's quote: when two mature people are in love, says Osho, one of the greatest paradoxes of life happens. What is one of the greatest paradoxes of life? They are together and yet tremendously alone. They are almost one, but their oneness does not destroy their individuality. They help each other become more free. I think that is such a beautiful way to express that when two mature people are in love, they are together and yet tremendously alone. They're together and yet tremendously alone. And the other piece of insight that I want to conclude this presentation on, from the book on maturity by Osho, is he says marriage brings out whatsoever is hidden in you. If love is hidden in you, it brings it out. If love was a facade, then it will disappear. How many people have known people who get married and then the love disappears? Perhaps love was just a facade, and then marriage brought out what was hidden in you. So then he says, then the ugly personality will show up. Love is not destroyed by marriage, it is destroyed by people who don't know how to love. So we sometimes blame the marriage. No, don't blame the marriage. Blame the destruction on love by people who don't know how to love. And he leads us to a very controversial point that I'm grappling with in my own life now. He says, love is eternal if it is true. If you accept the realities of love life, it keeps on growing every day. Nothing can destroy it. Love is eternity. Isn't that interesting? Because what he talks about as a mature marriage or a mature love or a mature relationship is one where you know that in a relationship, the roses are few and far between, says Osho, but many, 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 many thorns. If you can accept that the roses are few and far between, and there are many thorns, and the thorns don't lead you to run from the relationship, you accept that in nature, just as love is a fragrance, the thorns and the roses are part of that unity we call love. When you come to that state of accepting in a non-dualistic way, as the flower means the flower and the thorns, you accept it, you accept the relationship that way. It creates a tremendous resilience. So you don't flinch and run from the relationship and withdraw your hand and withdraw your embrace of the other just because you felt a few thorns. On that note, folks, I bring down the curtain to today's presentation, but not before I say Ajay's quote, one often meets his destiny on the road he takes to avoid it. Beautiful. Master Uguay. And I'm going to ask Ajay in a minute to elaborate upon that. But before I do that, for those of you who are new, I want to again explain that this is a phase of the presentation where we have ended with the presentation phase of the seminar and liberated you from my bondage. Now, it is a time where if you want to leave, you can leave. And of course, you could leave anytime, but it's also an explicitly provided opportunity for you to exit if you so desire. If you would like to stay on, by all means, please stay on. I will be ending the recording at this point so that I don't have anything that the participants are saying, posted on YouTube without their consent.